have a question for you. Do you want to start sleeping with the lights on? If so, I got you. The most horrifying found footage that will leave you shaking while I take fear factor to a whole new level. Next up, we have the No End House story. This one's a bit more recent, and it's based on a very popular internet urban legend. The story goes that a man named Brian Russell explored an abandoned house with a strange layout where, each room seemed to shift and change. It's framed as a lengthy first-person account of, a trip through this really weird, twisted house. It's a haunted attraction that boosts a series of scarier and scarier rooms. But the twist, which isn't really a spoiler, given that, the TV show uses it to cap off the first episode, is that the person telling the story might not have ever even left the house. The footage shows Brian navigating the house, but what starts as a curious exploration, quickly turns into a desperate fight for survival. But here's the thing, this footage is allegedly real, and Brian Russell is a real person. He's a filmmaker who actually created the footage as part of a project, but the way it's presented makes it seem like it's actual found footage. So there's a lot of speculation over that. And let me tell you, it is seriously unsettling. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, but wait, isn't found footage just a bunch of shaky cameras and fake scares? And to that I say, not always. Sometimes found footage can be genuinely terrifying, especially when it's based on real events. Next, we have the Phoenix Lights incident in 1997. Thousands of people in Phoenix, Arizona reported seeing a massive V-shaped UFO in the sky. The footage shows a strange glowing object hovering above the city, and it's genuinely chilling. But what makes this story even more fascinating is that the footage is real, and it was captured by multiple people on different cameras. It's one of the most well-documented UFO sightings in history, and it's still unexplained to this very day. On March 13th, 1997, two formations of lights were sighted in the skies over the valley and other parts of Arizona. One was shaped like a V and cruised across the sky, while the other was a series of glowing orbs that appeared in a line near the Sierra Estrella mountain range. The two incidents became known just as the Phoenix Lights, one of the largest and best known UFO sightings in history. Now, thousands of people across Arizona witnessed this phenomenon, which caused, a kind of hullabaloo in the media over the next few months that grew into a worldwide obsession. Despite the public, searching for answers about what caused, the Phoenix Lights, both at the time and over, the ensuing decades, no official investigation has ever actually occurred. Several explanations were put forth to explain the mysterious lights, ranging from helicopters to camera lens flares. But of course, the favorite explanation was a spacecraft. Did we finally have good video proof that mankind is being visited by aliens? Well, who knows? Others ones weren't so sure though, and suggested that the bright lights resembled nighttime skydivers with flares. To some, this explanation seemed even more outlandish than, extraterrestrial, spacecrafts flying by to watch, a high school football game. I mean, what would skydivers be doing with flares in the night sky though? And if they were skydivers and had done this before, why wouldn't people have known about it or even recognized it? Was it, a prank or a hoax? As the story got more and more, publicity, a helicopter pilot for Fox Channel 10, actually, his name was Rick Krebs, he went on air and basically told what he knew, and apparently he knew a lot. We have the infamous Dybbuk Box. You might have heard of this story before, but for those who haven't, let me fill you in. As the story goes, a Dybbuk Box appeared in 2003 when antique store owner Kevin Manis bought a vintage wine box from a 103-year-old Holocaust survivor on eBay. After a strange string of unexplained hauntings, reoccurring nightmares, bruises, and smells of ammonia, the box found its way back onto eBay and landed in the hands of a man named Jason Haxton. Now, he too felt the wrath of the box and ended up burying it somewhere in Missouri, but not before pulling it out of the ground to appear on the television show Ghost Adventures. Haxton had paid $280 for the box, and when opened, contained a goblet, 2 locks of hair tied with string, pennies from the 1920s, a dried rosebud, a cast iron candlestick holder, and a granite statue engraved with Hebrew letters. Haxton said that he didn't believe the stories associated with the box and didn't have any worries when opening it. He heard strange noises though, moving objects, and unexplained events that will send chills down your spine. Well, at least it did mine. The cabinet was described as a wine cabinet to him. Jason reported that he would start hearing these strange noises coming from the cabinet, such as like knocking sounds and whispers. He also also claimed to have seen very, shadowy figures lurking around the cabinet, and even reported feeling the presence in the room with him. As the strange occurrences continued, Jason began to research, the history of the cabinet. He discovered that it had once belonged to a Jewish family who had immigrated to the United States from Poland. The family had reportedly used the cabinet to store their belongings, but had also used it as a makeshift altar. Now, Jason became convinced that the cabinet was haunted, and according to the legend, a Dybbuk is a spirit that is created when a person passes in a state of great emotional turmoil, such as sadness or anger. The spirit is said to be trapped between the world of the living and the afterlife, and is often drawn to objects or places that hold a lot of sentimental value. As the occurrences continued, Jason decided to seek out the help of a rabbi who specialized in Jewish mysticism. Now, the rabbi performed a ritual to cleanse the cabinet of the Dybbuk, but it didn't work apparently. Jason eventually became so convinced that the cabinet was just way too haunted and decided to sell it. It definitely wouldn't have taken me that long. It would have been gone night one, but I guess he really loved the cabinet. However, despite trying to sell it, he soon discovered it wasn't easy to get rid of. Several people who had purchased the cabinet from him reported experiencing the same occurrences, including nightmares, noises, even physical attacks. Once Jason did get rid of it, it was actually purchased by another collector who then chose to remain anonymous. That collector reported experiencing strange things as well. Apparently, the two at one point had actually gotten together to discuss their experiences with the box and shared stories. And, he helped actually Jason track down the family that originally had the box. But what makes this story even more terrifying is that, again, these are real people. Jason wrote a book about it, which, went on to sell a lot of copies, and it is, of course, one of the most haunted books that exists. Today, the Dybbuk Box is actually said to be in the possession of the anonymous collector, who has reportedly taken whatever steps necessary to just protect himself and his family from the evil spirit. However, the legend of the Dybbuk Box continues to captivate people around the world. It may remain, convinced that it is indeed haunted, and Jason's story has been the subject of much debate and speculation. Now, there's also footage on YouTube, though, of a man named Joseph Mazzaferro opening a Dybbuk Box at 3 a.m. It's frightening. I had my eyes half shut the whole time. You can hear something speaking back to him. I won't ruin it for you, but go look for it for yourself and let me know what you think. The first story is titled What Comes Next. It's a strange and unexplained story I found on a page dedicated to creepy real life stories. This is about a guy named Michael who grew up in the digital age. He loves smartphones and would always go for digital over real life social interactions. However, there was one night out of the week he would never miss, which was horror movie night with his buddies. His Friday night ritual was to watch the latest horror flick with his friends, then go home and just prepare for bed. On one of those nights, one of Michael's friends brought an old dusty VHS tape to watch. This was apparently found in the attic of a passed on family member's house in Vancouver. As his friend Jackson walked in with the tape, they were all really excited to give it a go. The host spent about 30 minutes looking for his old VHS player, and when they found it, they immediately took the tape, shoved it in, and began to watch. Right after the film started, there was nothing but silence in the room, so everyone, was seated tightly in their chair and was giving it their full attention. The film was actually about a demon that possessed its victims by presenting itself as a friend calling herself Lila. About halfway through the film became more and more sinister as Lila would establish a bond with her victims before she made her move. It almost seemed as though Lila cared about them before she destroyed their lives. Once fooled, she was able to possess them. You could see it in her dreadful eyes, long teeth, long nails, and shrunken face. The style in which the film was shot also made the group very uneasy, as it was mostly presented in the point of view of the victims and even the demon, making it unbelievably realistic. They began to feel breathless and helpless when the film ended, with Lila playing hopscotch with a group of friends that she met in a park. After everyone had finished watching the film, Michael, along with everyone else, was feeling physically exhausted from the film. film and just needed some fresh air. He didn't like what he had seen and wanted to basically just forget about it. I mean, I don't blame him, honestly. They then decided to watch a comedy to let some time pass, and after a short while, Micah was feeling good again and had basically forgotten about the film. The group then went to get some fast food and then went their separate ways. Now later that night, Michael decided to de-stress and relax by playing some online slots before bed. He actually found that this was a great way to kind of unwind and just have a little bit of fun. It was late and he decided to get ready to shut off and prepare for sleep, but right before he shut off, he got a message from a girl called Lila. She invited him to check out this new online slot. Now, Michael was tired, and without even realizing who the message was actually sent from, he just opened the link and out of instinct and not knowing what was going to happen next. He did fall asleep, but then was actually woken up in like a puddle of sweat, completely drenched, to what he thought was just, a bad dream, like a nightmare where he was being watched by something that he couldn't quite explain. Now, over the next few days, Michael would begin to feel sick and even tell his friends that he wasn't feeling good and wouldn't make it to their next movie night, which he never missed. But here's the problem. Michael disappeared. He not only didn't make it to the next movie night, he didn't even make it out, period. His friends stopped hearing from him. He virtually just vanished. And although some time has passed, and most people assumed, that he just wanted to go live off the grid and disappear and, close everyone out, his close group of friends actually think otherwise, and they are convinced it has something to do with that VHS tape that they probably shouldn't have watched in the first place. Creepy. This next story comes from a Vespertine on Reddit. This person claims they inherited a collection of paranormal VHS tapes from their uncle, and they took them actually to a shop to try and sell them off. This person explains that throughout the 80s and 90s, his uncle recorded various tapes on his Retrovision TV and picked up some pretty spooky stuff. He explained that with his last breath, he told him to unhook the VCR and hide it with the tape collection, and so he did. But not even a day later, the Retrovision was gone, but the tapes were left untouched. He said, "I don't know who took it or how they knew about my uncle's passing so quickly, but I can only assume they didn't know about the tapes. I was terrified that they'd find out about the modifications and come back for the tapes, but they never did. And they've been in my possession ever since." Now, he continued to say, "My uncle told me to never watch the tapes alone, and I was too scared to ever tell anyone else about them, so I've never watched them. I don't know what's on them, but I know the kind of things you can see on a Retrovision, so I figured they might be worth something to the right buyer." Now, this shop owner looked at his collection of tapes and actually read them out. One was titled "And We All Fall Down," another titled "Crying Girl in the Woods," another was labeled as "It's Already Too Late," and one with the title "Pity Us." Now, the shop owner asked, "If your uncle's been gone for about 20 years or so, why are you only selling them now?" He responded by saying, "Well, I was pretty much still a kid when he passed, and by the time I was old enough to start looking into my uncle's occult connections, I had largely forgotten about the tapes. I just recently started poking around on heroichollows.net to see if I could find anything that might have had anything to do with my uncle, and that's how I found out about this place," which is the shop he was at. Now, the shop owner said, "Listen, kid, before I make you an offer, I'm going to have to check at least a few of these to make sure they're legit," nodding to the 13-inch TV and VCR combo that he already had waiting on his desk. Now, he hesitated for a moment. He knew before, he came in that he would need to watch the videos, and he had been looking forward to finally actually seeing what was on the tapes himself. But after so many years of avoiding the tapes, he was perhaps, understandably, wary of what would happen when he finally unlocked their secrets. He said, "You think it's safe? If so, then go ahead." After a few seconds of static, a grainy and kind of desaturated image of a man in a chair, he appeared on screen, this man. He was sitting in a chair. The chair was cast from rusted steel, and while the room he was sitting in there was pretty concrete as far as they could see, the man was completely bald with a drawn and haggard face. His eyes were kind of a jaundiced yellow, and his skin was brown like aged paper and hung very loosely off of his face, as if he had recently lost an enormous amount of weight. Now, his clothes were ragged and woven from, some coarse and kind of faded fabric, and he wondered if he was a political prisoner of some kind. He held his gaze on the camera for a few seconds, looked down at a scrap piece of paper in his hand, hands and then cleared his throat and said, "It wasn't our fault. They demanded sacrifice. They demanded obedience. We could not resist. All of our strength of mind and will and of our flesh was sacrificed in their name, and we had become too weak to resist." This whole speech went on for like several minutes with him talking about, sacrifices and just a lot of other cryptic things. The boy and the shop owner heard some sort of signal playing over the man's speech, and they said it was very unsettling, and it was kind of like Morse code. Now, the shop owner started to desperately press stop, pause, and eject on the VCR, trying to get the tape out. When the tape continued to play, he then knocked the TV to the ground. He then grabbed his cane and actually swung it at the TV to smash it. The shop owner screamed in frustration, falling to his knees, and basically said that, this was like a psychotronic signal that they heard, and once it was deep enough into their brains, it would pull them into a different reality. How he knew all this, I don't know, but they said they started hearing loud noises, and he forced himself to look up, and when he did, he said he saw like the silhouette of a demon among them that was slowly stretching its arm out to him. He said right before this demon kind of like touched him that the shop owner hit it with his cane again, and suddenly everything just disappeared. The shop owner said these tapes have the power to summon demons and bring them into other realities, which is why his uncle probably never wanted him to show these to anyone or be seen by anybody. The shop owner said, had he watched these alone, he actually could have been sucked into another world with absolutely no way out. Now, whether this story is true or not, it definitely is really creepy. And I know personally I got some old VHS tapes sitting in my closet, but I'm definitely not gonna be finding my VCR to put them in anytime soon.
We're kicking things off with a movie that's so heinous, technically I shouldn't be talking about it. I can't even say the words that make up its title. We're gonna call it the people-eating mass extinction event of the 1930s. So this flick wasn't the director's first movie about people eating, but it was definitely the one that got the most flack from the media. His name is Ruggero Deodato, by the way. He'd been making films since the 1960s, and he had this trademark style. Flashy, grimy pictures with a hardened edge, and plenty of coitus and violence. He was one of many Italian directors who facilitated the people-eating boom of the late 1970s, and he'd already made a film about it, The Last C-Word World, before he got around to this one. So this movie is the story of a professor journeying to the Amazon to discover what happened to a film crew of missing brave young Americans, only to realize that this characterization couldn't have been further from the truth. From the get-go, the movie looks at how the mass media portrays its fellow Americans, the marginalization of those outside the land of the free, and what it means to be civilized. The young filmmakers are immediately positioned by the media as victims of local savagery, and when anthropologist Dr. Monroe is said to find them, it is only through his embracing of culture that he comes across the lost film reels that's going to piece all of this together. Broadcasting executives back in New York are foaming at the mouth at the prospect of a new documentary. Even more sensational, let's give it to me. Well, these filmmakers are so focused on sensation and viewing figures that the sizzle reel that they show include, well, just a couple of little antics. Oh, what? Well, let's see. Forcible amputation. Why? Well, somebody got a snake bite and something had to go. Now, there isn't a lot more I can talk about in detail when it comes to the plot of this one for safety reasons, as is the case with a lot of old school exploitation flicks. Everything was seized on the grounds of obscene stuff. But then something crazy happened. By the way, this is real world stuff. All of this became evidence in criminal proceedings. This wasn't just a plain old too devious for public consumption theatrical release. People thought this was a snuff film, and apparently the weirdos who made it were so brazen that we're gonna throw a premiere for it. The director was brought up on killing charges, and he was forced to bring his actors in for interviews to be like, look, they're alive, they're just good actors. So then he had to demonstrate how they did a lot of the special effects in the movie. Thankfully, eventually all the charges were dismissed, but whew, the courts eventually overturned the movie's ban several years afterwards. But by this point, the director and a lot of his associates had a lot of legal troubles, and everybody was like, we can't show this. Also, they were really censoring it. By the way, before I move on, the film isn't without its faults. Although 6 animal deaths appear on screen, 7 animals sadly lost their lives for the production, because there's the scene where the monkey dies. It was done twice. So I'm not saying it's ethically great, but yeah. Before the shot-for-shot American remake called Quarantine, Wreck was a claustrophobic Spanish found footage effort that brought a fresh dose of claustrophobia and terror to the zombie genre. A TV reporter and her cameraman are conducting a routine interview at a local fire station when an emergency call comes in. Accompanying the firefighters to a nearby apartment, the news team begins recording the crazy screams coming from inside an elderly woman's unit. After authorities seal off the building to contain the threat, the news crew, firefighters, and residents are stuck facing a lethal terror inside. With the camera running, survival for everybody involved seems kind of unlikely. So Wreck is quite unsettling as it moves at a restless clip, using the found footage device to inject a new kind of immediacy to the zombie concept, which is kind of funny because normally zombies are quite slow. The plot is simple enough, and the cast is populated by stock characters, but the film overcomes the shackles of its tropes with pure energy and, well, how it did things, including the absence of any music on the soundtrack until the end of it. So it often really does feel like you're watching a horrific documentary, one that continues with the same breathless momentum in the sequel. And as the unpredictability of the scares goes from one act to the next, it's kind of hard to watch without some lights on. Looking to cash in on the success of films like Paranormal Activity and The Last Exorcism, The Devil Inside tries its best to be something that is, well, doomed to fail. The film desperately wants to have that same creepiness and, all the stuff that made its predecessor so great. But unfortunately for director William Brent Bell, The Devil Inside squanders what could have been a pretty good movie, opting instead to rely on found footage trends in a bad way, and also a horrible, pretentious ending. So this movie revolves around a woman named Isabella Rossi. She travels to Italy to investigate her mother's involvement in a series of exorcisms gone wrong. Along with a documentary filmmaker, they visit a mental institution to meet with her mom. Now this film was kind of, well, it was the worst movie of 2012. And it's very, very bad, and not bad in a good way. It's the kind of bad that gives bad a bad name. Lingering only on one screen in just one movie theater 5 weeks after its release. Look, the people filming this must have been like, oh, we can fix this in post. Yet turns out they can't. No retroactive intervention would infuse a single frame of it with the merest little bit of terror that was promised in the ad campaign. And because of this, the producers were kind of forced to rely on an entirely, well, it was just a cop-out. And it ended the film with a link to a website at which further information on the case in the movie can be found. Sure, on the surface, the premise is actually somewhat intriguing. The Italian backdrop seems like a cool locale for a movie like this. We all know, Italian films tend to really go for it. And the prospect of unsanctioned exorcisms is also a nice twist on the genre, good trope, and there are a few interesting character-driven subplots that really could have taken the story to another level. But here's the problem. None of these things ever reach a sound conclusion. But on top of that, the writing and acting, it's not really it. Grandma and Helmuth are kinda bad, making the already too serious tone seem all the more ridiculous. And even some of the really good acting is just really wasted on some brutal dialogue that's only really reserved for student films. This is only amplified when the characters speak directly into the camera as they launch into massive streams of exposition and pointless narration. The R-rated language also seems really forced and unnecessary, especially when the demons cast out taunts at Isabella and the priests. It seemed like somebody just learned a bunch of bad words and they're like, we're gonna say it all right now. VHS was one of the most exciting horror anthologies in recent years, and it managed to find a newer spin on the found footage genre by giving a bunch of emerging filmmaking talent the opportunity to explore the approach in their own unique ways. It contains contributions from some of the more ambitious micro-budget American filmmakers working today, which none of them also exclusively work in horror. The concept's parameters were kind of simple. They were developed by Brad Miska, founder of the horror fan site BLOOTY Disgusting. A group of young hooligans are tasked with stealing a mysterious tape from an ominous home. When they come across a heap of unidentified tapes, well, then we've got the framing device begins, as each cassette contains another morbid encounter. What happens? Well, the resulting experience is their own private horror festival, with shorts by known indie filmmakers David Bruckner, Glenn McQuaid, Joe Swanberg, T. West, and the online filmmaking collective known as Radio Silence. Now, despite the chorus of indie names involved in its production, VHS maintains a surprisingly fluid structure. The lo-fi video quality and overwhelming atmosphere carry over into each chapter. Most segments have a fair share of cheap scares, but they also delve into the art of the build-up, delivering a series of grim jokes with some really great punchlines. It works to a large degree because it asks for original lo-fi stories from filmmakers who already excelled at doing just that, and it's a total blast to see them all working together in ghoulish harmony. The equally delightful sequel, by the way, proved this approach wasn't an anomaly, but we want more. And finally for today, Stephen Cognetti's House LLC. Yeah, it might not have much to distinguish it from other found footage films in terms of setup, but it was so good. So what's the premise? Well, there's this documentary crew investigating a haunted house that's been closed for about 15 years, only for the ghosts of the past to haunt them and leave everybody dead. Oh, spoiler. With such a bare-bones setup, it doesn't have a lot to work with, but it does so well at a high level. The director excels at building out a demented specific landscape for his cast to run around in, and delivers genuinely terrifying terrors to match. Some aspects work, some don't, but you get some sequels. I think it's a great example of modern day horror at its finest. There's some pretty decent scares. The props the group uses, by the way, in particular the mannequins with the masks, pretty scary. The limited view of Paul's camcorder makes for some unsettling moments, even though there's a couple of times where it's like, dude, just put down the camera and help your friends or run away. But it works. Oh, before I forget, by the way, if you're afraid of clowns, maybe tread lightly with this one. And hey, even if you aren't, I like clowns, you might be when the film ends.